So my last video did really well. It's got for me an absolute ton of views, which is nice. A lot of people share around. A lot of people seem to like it. A bit of criticism there, but whatever, you know, that's the way it goes. It's just nice. But what I've noticed is that when you get a video which takes off like that, for me, you know, for my view count, that was a lot. It's kind of a bit, it piles of pressure on you a little bit, because then you think, well, what am I going to do next? How am I going to top that? If you're sort of under the shadow of the previous video. So I thought I would just sort of not play along that game at all and have a bit of a low-key kind of bit of a ramble as I go around on my walk here and clear my mind of some of the other stuff which has been going on at the minute. And I was, what I was thinking about is, it's a thing that I keep coming back to, but it's the subject of nostalgia, and the way nostalgia, like, sort of hangs across our world now in like this big dark cloud. And that I've spoke about this quite a lot. I did a video earlier on in the year where, like, is it normal to have the degree of nostalgia that we have in our sort of culture as it exists now, and in my view it has existed for the last 20 years or so, and I don't think it is at all. And so this morning I was listening to absolute 90s, so I'm more of a 90s kid than the 80s, but it's all there for you now, you know. There's all these radio stations. There's absolute 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s and the 2000s, and maybe even the 2010s one, I don't know, but I wouldn't be able to tell the difference anyway. But so what I find is interesting about that is that this is pandering to the market for nostalgia. So your nostalgia will be catered to. Your like yearning for your youth. So in my case, it's the 90s. For others, it'll be different decades. But that means that there's so many people like get into that it's now being commercialized and marketed and commodified. Like your nostalgia is now a product. But like, I actually go along with that. I don't mind tuning in to absolute 90s for a bit now and then. So I'm there listening to this morning, absolute 90s. I get a bit of Radiohead, I get High and Dry from the Bends, I got a bit of Placebo, who are total degenerates. They did have a few songs though, really catchy ones. And then there was some obscure kind of, one of the, in the 90s you had a load of pop bands that had sort of male men doing the guitars and the instruments, and then you had like a woman doing the vocals, and one of the more obscure ones was called Echo Belly, and one of their songs came on as well. And then there was an REM track came on from the Automatic from the People album, and which is, funny enough, that's actually a nostalgic album itself. It's about Michael Stipe leaving small town America to become a pop star and looking back on his journey, if you like. So it's absolutely steeped in this sort of warm glow of Americana. I mean, when people say that the Gen X in the 90s was just all cynicism, there's a lot of that, but it can be a bit overdone. Some of the biggest ones, like REM, were doing it in earnest. They weren't really being ironic. Well, on some of the songs they did. But nevertheless, that was the kind of thing. So there I am, sitting in my comfort zone with the music of my youth, and then disaster strikes, because what do I get? I get the bastard Stereophonics coming in. And I always despised the Stereophonics, and I just looked it up, because I know people will be correcting us in the comments. But the Stereophonics, actually, they are of the 90s, they were from 92, but they didn't really get big until the early 2000s. And I always hated everything about their music, because they didn't really get big until after the sort of Britpop 90s era faded. When it was on its way out and we're heading towards the millennial, that's when Stereophonics came into their own. And so I don't really see it as belonging to my sort of Gen X. I think it's a sort of, it's the millennials beginning to impose themselves in a way. But even if you leave aside all of that kind of thing, I do think it's fair to say the Stereophonics were just shite. I like, objectively speaking, I just thought that he couldn't sing. Every line of all of their songs seemed to end in him like wailing, like why or die or cry or shy or high. The end of every line seems to be like that as well. I hated the stupid croaky voice that he did. It was the only decent song they had. They ripped off of Rod Stewart, and for me it was just this sign that the good times were over, and that the new stuff that was catching on was just garbage, and it was boring, and it was a sort of kind of pastiche of what had gone like literally just a year or two before them in the charts, and what people were listening to, what people were getting into. So I always thought the Stereophonics were just shit, and the sign of things to come. But worse than that, like much worse, and all of this got like sort of, I was ambushed with this shit on the radio as well. It was, oh fuck me, the fucking Stereophonics have come on. But worse than all of that is that they reminded me of Jamie Oliver. And in the 2000s, I lived away, and I kept coming back. I'd come back for Christmas, and every time I came back home, it was as if the TV would always be on at the family home. But then it was like Jamie Oliver was on the television, like all of the time, every channel, every programme, Jamie Oliver was there. And he had his own TV show as well, and it was to the soundtrack of the Stereophonics. So the gist of Jamie Oliver's TV show then, while I'm just stuck in the rain here under a tree, the gist of his TV show was that him and his wife, I think she was called Jules. I told you this was going to be a ramble, but I'll get to the point in a minute. Him and his wife called Jules had like a posh house in London, in Chelsea or Notting Hill or one of those places. And each week, the picture, it's so bad, the picture of it all was that each week she would have organised like a dinner party or something, and they'd have other friends coming around, and it would be like Teresa, the head of the HR department from some bank, or Jemima, who like did arts and crafts, would come up from Brighton, and all of this kind of palaver. And oh no, I bet you couldn't believe it, but it turns out that they forgot all the food. It turns out they've got nothing in, and it's only 5 hours until the guests arrive, and there's nothing prepared, nothing cooked out. So then that meant that Jamie had to go off and find some food. And what he would do, the next phase of the programme then would be where Jamie Oliver like rides around London on a little moped in like a pea-pod helmet, and what he would do would go to all of these markets. So the idea of it was that he knew where you could get all this tucker mucker grub and all of this, you know, he put on the act of like a Cockney white boy, which was just totally fake. And the idea was that he'd go along and he'd know where you could get like Bulgarian wines, or he'd know where there would be like a little shop, a Mongolian shop somewhere which was selling Mongolian yogurt, or he'd know where to go where you could pick up like proper octopus from the Mediterranean and all of this kind of thing. And then he'd put them all in like an ice pack or a basket on the front of his moped and drive them home just in time. And it was always like, oh, the guests are just arriving and we're just about to pull it out of the oven, and it's just there. So on the one hand, I mean, it's typical at that time as well. You got the Hugh Grant kind of rom-coms at that time as well, in like literally in Notting Hill. So in the sort of Blairite era, you had this huge push to romanticise London. But there's something else that they're doing as well, and it was that they're kind of shilling neoliberalism. This was the beginning of the real agenda, the multiculturalism, political correctness. The sinister parts of it hadn't yet come in, but they sold it on like, look at all these products you can get. Look at all this cheese. Look at all these fancy tomatoes you can get from Spain. Isn't it amazing? Imagine how it'll be amazing when we get all these people from all over the world, and they're all going to bring all of this cuisine. And in a way, like Jamie Oliver riding around was like a tour of all of this in London. And it was just to say, oh, you don't need look at our shite, look at our corned beef and our potatoes. Look how great it is in London that we can get Romanian cheese or like Turkish wine. I mean, you can actually see here that as far as Britain's concerned, the British shitlib, the British modern FBE, Twitter, politically correct sort of NPC drone is being birthed in this era. They're being forged in the basket of Jamie Oliver's moped, alongside the quail eggs and the Japanese lager and the French duck steaks and all of the other pretentious bourgeois middle class wank that came in that era, which became fetishized because it was a very lucrative sort of social status. It was about the social status that the incoming neoliberalism, I mean, it had been there for a while, but when it was really gathering pace, you can see that they, in a way, they came in with this and that mentality, and for me, like, it became something softer, and you get that transition from the 90s, which I would regard the true 90s, which was a bit more angsty and a kind of ironic and all of this, but with some genuine emotion there. And then as you head into the 2000s, that's what you get. You get the Stereophonics, like Why Cry, High and Die, whining on with a shit grovelly voice, as the soundtrack to Jamie Oliver scooting around London, like trying to get like peppered Russian steaks or something like that for his middle class wank dinner party, which is coming in. And so it was the way that the whole thing of the 90s became that. It was funneled in that direction, and you can see that it creates all kinds of problems. You can see that it's like the crucible that gave us so much shite that we've got to deal with today. So it isn't just a sort of nostalgia fest, it's something more than that. You can trace back these cultural trends in a way that you can see how politics and thinking, especially today, has been imprinted on this romanticised kind of multicultural, all of the food and the cuisine of London. Isn't it also magnificent era? Of course, in the north, it wasn't as pretty. It wasn't as pretty at all, which I've spoken a lot in the past.